Hello and welcome to my July reading wrap up. A little bit belated, which was kind of planned. I took the month off filming in August for most of August. It's like the 26th today, so technically this is gonna be up in August, which is all that really matters. Basically on time. I moved. You can't tell by the way things look behind me, but I'm in a different location. I'm not certain on like the lighting situation yet. It's a little bit like questionable. I just don't know what I'm doing yet. So I'm doing the best that I can at the moment, and things will probably get a little bit more regular come September as I get used to being here and actually unpack, because you can't see in the frame, but I'm surrounded by so many boxes. Like, I had to move boxes just to have somewhere to sit in front of my shelves. I have 8 books to talk about for July. I have read 13 books so far in August, so if I've forgotten anything about these books, that's why. But let's get into it. I have 7 books here, and then I read 1 book from the library. So, as always, I have to flip them over because I put them in the order of like the last one I read on top, which makes sense when I'm putting them on the shelf, and then I go to film and I'm like, that doesn't work. So, let's get into it. The first thing that I read in August was Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Everyone read this book like 3 years ago, I think. Fixing the lighting in my glasses. That's something I didn't deal with before. Everyone read this like 3 years ago and talked about how good it was. And every time someone talked about it, I thought, that sounds like something I would enjoy. And then I never read it. I don't know why. So I read it finally, and I gave it 4 stars. This is the story of a young woman. I believe she's in her 20s. She works kind of a dead-end job-ish. She's like an accountant or a bookkeeper at a small company, and she's very odd. And not odd in like a cute, quirky, oh, look at this girl, she's so different, we all love her, but odd in the sense of like, she's very blunt with people, she's very off-putting, she's very judgmental, she has no concept of how to relate to people, and this all stems from her very severe childhood trauma. This book is a lot darker than I expected it to be going in, and I'm surprised more people haven't like discussed that in their reviews, because on the back it kind of sounds like this is gonna be like a fluffy romantic, like, oh, she's cute and quirky and this dude is like a little bit quirky in a different way, and they meet and kind of have a life going on. And like, technically that description is correct. But only technically. It's a lot about her. It's a lot about her childhood trauma, her inability to relate to people and see the world in the way that like other people view the world, and kind of she's very, very judgmental with what she does. She has her routine. She has a lot of like mental health issues. She has a social worker who keeps up with her, again, because of all the trauma. I really enjoyed it. This was a 4-star, like, fantastic. It's just as good as everyone says. Eleanor is not a very likable character, but I think Honeyman does like a really good job of capturing her perspective of the world. So you really like, you don't identify with her so much, but you really understand where she's coming from and like why she's seeing these things about the situation, and like in a way where like, oh, something seems normal to you and Eleanor thinks it's very strange. And it was really, really interesting. Like, this is one of those books that like the perspective of it was done so well, and the writing style was lovely. It was a little bit odd and disjointed because it is like Eleanor's thoughts, which are odd and disjointed, but really, really fascinating. The only thing I struggled with kind of was the ending. And by the ending, I mean like the final third of the book. It was such a messy, complex situation, and in the final third, it felt like it was going by too quickly. Like, she was making too much progress and too many changes in a way that didn't make sense, and it kind of just seemed like it was resolved a little bit too easily. Like, she needed a lot more time for the growth that was happening. So it did lose me a little bit there, but I thoroughly enjoyed this. Like, I'm kind of annoyed with myself that it took me so long to read it, because it is just fantastic and I would highly recommend. And then I read The Good Girls by Sonia Falero, which I also gave 4 stars. This is basically the month of 4 stars, so just get prepared for that, because I gave pretty much everything 4 stars this month. This is a true crime book about the deaths of 2 girls that happened in India and kind of went viral. They were hanged from a tree. They were assumed to have been sexually assaulted, and pictures of the girls' bodies hanging from the tree went viral around India, and it was a huge deal. There was a massive case involved, and like, this is basically a book of Sonia Falero's investigative journalism of like what happened, like from start to finish, like with all the investigations of different government agency, of all the suspects involved, of the family, like who's lying, who's telling the truth, what really happened. And it's just the story, and it's a lot about rape culture in India and what that means, and it was really, really fascinating. I will say, going into this book, I thought this was fiction, and it took me like 2 chapters to be like, this doesn't seem like fiction, and it wasn't. But once I adjusted like my mindset to like, I'm reading a nonfiction book, this was really, really interesting. It's just a really like great, heart-wrenching deep dive into this case, like everything about it. Like, if you're interested in just like a full kind of overview of one entire case and kind of like what it means in the greater perspective of like India at the time, I would highly recommend this. I think that was fascinating. The characters in this book were fascinating. I mean, by characters, obviously real people. Really well captured, lots of great journalism. The things I struggled with, because I did really, really enjoy this book, but it was one of those books that like, I was never like excited to pick it up, if that makes sense. Like, I was really enjoying it, but it was never one that I was like, oh, I need to like read that now. It was like, I guess I should probably pick up The Good Girls again. It's been like a day. And I kind of had to like make myself get through it, even though I really enjoyed it. The structure of it was kind of basic. It was very much like, this is what happened. Point A, point B, point C, point D, the end. And I felt like it could have used a little bit more like, I don't know what I'm really saying here. Writing, maybe? Like, it's a fairly short book. Like, it doesn't look short, but there is so much information in here. Like, information overload, and I felt like had she fluffed up the writing a little bit, it would have felt a little bit less like fact, and I would have like retained it better, and it would have felt like a more compelling narrative instead of just like listing all the information, which was kind of how it came across. Like, it needed a little bit more like fluffing, almost like not pointless fluffing, but like storytelling fluffing. And I'm not being like, oh, like she should have like fictionalized it, because you can fluff stuff and you can make it read smoother and like fuller while still just being journalism. And I think it needed a little bit of that. And also at the end, she had like one long note in her author's note about striving for objectivity in this book, and that kind of bothered me. Like, it wasn't something that bothered me while reading it, because like, people have biases. Like, her biases were kind of clear in this book, and it felt like they were addressed well. And it was like, she was writing a book because she wanted to write about rape culture in India, which like made sense, and it was really well done. And then at the end, she was writing about like, oh, like I was striving for objectivity, to be as objective as possible, because I felt like that was important. And I think that was kind of some of my issues with the writing, it not being full enough. Like, she was trying to be too objective. And B, I also just struggled with like, we have biases, like any journalist does, and I think it's impossible to be objective, and the better thing to strive to do is to address your biases, like make it part of the story. Like, it is subjective, like, because you're writing it, because you have like everything that matters to you and like your whole life story that like affects your perception of the events. You can't get rid of that. So I don't know, that bothered me. It didn't bother me in like the book itself, just like the author's note at the end kind of had me reflecting on things, but this was still really, really enjoyable, and it is one that I would highly recommend. Then I read Best American Crime Writing of 2004, edited by Otto Penzler and Thomas H. Cook. This is a book of journalism that was crime writing in 2004. I don't really know how else to describe this. It's just, it is what the title says. If you think you'll like this, you probably will. Like, I don't know. It's just journalism about crime from 2004. So it is a little bit dated, but like, I don't mind. I gave this 4 stars as well. Again, month of 4-star reads, which may be a little bit generous, but when I'm reading anthologies, I tend more towards the generous side, because for me it's like, if this has, I forget how many it has, but say it has 12 essays. 6 of them I didn't like, 3 of them were mediocre, 3 were fantastic. I want to give that like 4 stars, because for me, like, that makes it very worthwhile for me. That makes it very enjoyable, and it's like I can forget about the ones I didn't like and focus on like the 3 fantastic ones that like I'm really, really glad I read. I feel like that was kind of the ratio here, like fair amount I didn't like, some decent ones, some great ones. It's funny because 2 of these essays I'd already read before in other collections. One was Krakauer's essay that basically turned into Under the Banner of Heaven. That's what it was. I always want to say Where Men Win Glory, but that was the Pat Tillman book. It was the one about the Mormon brothers who killed their sister-in-law. So it's about, it's the article he wrote about that, and then one of them was about an escape artist / bank robber who just like escaped from prison constantly, which it was weird that I had read that one before, but I had, so I just skipped it. But the rest of them were pretty good. There were some great ones. The first one in particular was fantastic. It was about a serial killer in Mexico, and that the cops are basically doing nothing about it, and it was written by, I believe, a Mexican-American woman, and she said, like, she was down there in this city where, like, the girls were disappearing, and she got offered a job by this man and got really scared because, like, she suddenly realized how much she felt like the girls, and like she basically was one of the girls. It was a really beautiful essay. Beyond that, none of them have really stuck out to me, but there were definitely worthwhile ones. The weird thing about this book was how many of these essays were very conservative leaning, which I didn't expect. I thought it'd be more of like an even mix, and it was definitely very conservative leaning, but it was fine. Like, one of them was by a Kennedy, I forget which Kennedy, I think it was RFK Jr., about his cousin who'd been accused of murder at one point and convicted, and then his conviction was overturned, and like he was just like defending the cousin, which was weird, and I don't know, that was very off-putting. And there were a couple more that were just like, I don't know, I didn't love that, but there were a couple in here that were really, really worthwhile. So again, if the title makes you think you would like this book, you would probably like this book. I did. And then my library book was Ace, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex by Angela Chen. This was recommended to me by Bionicorn over at the Bookish Land. I saw her talking about this on her Instagram, and it sounded really fascinating, so I put it on hold at the library, and I wasn't expecting to get it till this fall, but I got it in July, so yeah, that's kind of just what I went with there. I also gave this 4 stars. This is a nonfiction book that's just about asexuality. Like, I don't really know. Again, it's one of those that, like, how do you describe it when it's just, like, such a basic topic? So it's about asexuality. It's basically just kind of an overview. Like, it's not, like, a very, like, in-depth book. It's pretty short, and Angela Chen is ace, so it's a lot about her experiences, like the people she's spoken to who are ace, like how you deal with it, like the intersectionality between like ace and feminism and racism and sexism and etc. Really interesting. I gave it 4 stars. Did I say that? I don't know. I gave it 4 stars. It was a good, worthwhile book. I think if you're looking for a book about asexuality, especially like a beginner's book, if you don't know anything about it, if you're just looking to learn, I think this is a fantastic place to start, because it's definitely written from the perspective of teaching people, like from the very beginning, like what it is, basically how people tend to find out their ace, like different people's experiences, different like studies. It was really, really interesting. I think for me, at a point, it kind of started losing me first because it was so kind of basic. And like, as someone who spent a lot of time on asexuality forums as like a teenager, it was like a lot of things that I had already known. And then I do think at a point she started kind of repeating information. Not necessarily like a lot, but it did seem like some of the anecdotes were repeats, and like some of the things she was saying kept circling back to the same points, which I don't know, I didn't love. It did, like, towards the end I was getting a little bit bored, but I still think it was really fantastic and would highly recommend this if you're trying to like educate yourself and broaden your knowledge. Canada by Richard Ford, again, 4 stars. This is a fiction novel about a young boy whose parents are in kind of like a rough financial situation. They're kind of like a working class, like very ordinary couple, and to get out of the situation, they decide to rob a bank. Not the most brilliant idea. Like, it's one of those things that's like very out of character for them. No one expected this. This is a very strange crime. And their teenage son winds up going away with like friends of the family, kind of like snuck away so he doesn't wind up in child protective services in a foster family. And he winds up in Canada in this very strange situation where more bad things happen there. And it's just a lot, basically. Spleen has decided to come over here and play, so you're just gonna hear her playing. Because I don't want to make her move. She's being very, very cute. Thank you, Spleen. We appreciate you. This is a painfully slow book. I like slow books, and even I, at a point, was thinking, wow, like, this is slow. It starts by saying, let's begin by telling you about the bank robbery. And then we get to the bank robbery 100 pages later. Not because so much happens in between, but just because it takes 100 pages to set it up because it's so painfully slow. I did really enjoy it, though. It was the kind of book where, like, nothing much really happened until the end, which was a little bit melodramatic for my taste, but whatever. It was just like this really slow character study. It wasn't fantastic, and it was definitely overwritten, but in the kind of way where I was like, I'm down, you know? I don't know that I'll be reading anything else by Richard Ford, but it was just like slow and nice, and just like you kind of get this full like view of the situation because nothing is happening, so you see all like the little things that don't matter and like kind of make it seem so much more full. But I don't know that I would really like recommend this a lot. Like, yes, I gave it 4 stars, but would anyone else? It did remind me a little bit of the Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, just in that like very like slow, like it's the story of like a young person growing up in like a strange situation. Weird things happen, sort of criminal things, but mostly just like it's this one boy's story, and lovely. I really did enjoy this. And the last 4-star book of the month was Trail of Broken Wings by Sejal Badani. This is a book of an Indian American family and their 3 daughters. The father was horrifically abusive towards the 3 daughters in different ways, and it's basically, it changes perspective between the 3 daughters and the mother as he's in a coma, and they're all kind of like coming to grips with like what that means for them. One of the daughters is, you know, a high profile finance person. I think she's in finance, something like that. One of them is like a stay-at-home wife, and then one of them is a photographer who travels the world. And it's just this family story. Despite giving this 4 stars, I don't know that this was necessarily like a fantastic book. I think it had a lot of flaws, and I could sit here for a lot longer telling you about the flaws than I could about the positives. I didn't really like the writing style a lot of the time. It was so overwritten and just like overwrought, you know, like it was trying so hard. Like I remember at one point, I don't remember the exact quote, but it was talking about like one of the girls and how like she feels very like there's a hole in her. You know, like that's a very basic description. She feels like there's a hole inside of her. And instead of saying that, the author says something like the cavity within that had opened years before. And it was like, that was how the whole book was written. And it was like, just use simple words sometimes. Like, not everything has to be so incredibly overwrought. Like, it was just overly described, everything. Like, sometimes the phrasing was weird because it was just like over the top and kind of ridiculous at points. And it was like some of the descriptions felt like they should have worked or would have worked in a different context because I got what she was going for, but it was just like a lot, like way too much, like needed to be dialed back so far. And also like this book did feel very melodramatic, like not because of necessarily the things that were happening, although like a little bit of melodrama there too, but mostly just because it did feel like a little bit shallow. Like the things that were happening weren't developed enough to really feel real. So because they had like that little bit of shallowness of undertone, it felt melodramatic because it felt fake. But despite that, did I have other critiques? I guess I should give you an example since I wrote one down. So it was like the way things happened that were melodramatic, you know? It was like two characters that were in a marriage, seemed blissfully happy, you know, like good marriage, good relationship, liked each other, and then one of them lied and was found out to have lied, and they just immediately went to divorce. Like no conversation, no like, oh no, can we fix things? Can we at least like talk things out to like see what happened? Just like, there's a lie, I can't believe you lied to me, left, separated, divorce papers. And it was like, who does this? Like, have a conversation for once. Like, I'm not upset that they were like getting divorced over this lie. I was upset that like there was no like preamble to it, there was no build up, there was no conversation, there was nothing. It was just like thing happened, immediately jumped to the worst possible thing. And like it was so weird. Like the whole book was written like that. And then the other thing I didn't like from looking at my notes, this book switched between third person perspective and first person perspective. There were 4 POV characters. 2 of them were in first, 2 of them were in third, and that bugged me. It was always like jarring when I switched back from first to third. Like I just don't enjoy that in the book. I've read it before. It's not my favorite thing. I kind of get what she was going for at a point, like to tell different character stories in different ways, but it just felt jarring because every time it switched, I had to like reacclimate myself to reading about she and her instead of I and me, and it was, I didn't like it. But the emotion in this book hit me. Like, I can complain all that I want about like all those little things, but this book made me cry and it made me happy, and it was just like the emotion was there. And I think maybe that was because a lot of the books I had been reading prior to this were not very emotional, you know, like Canada, not an emotional book. And then like the 3 nonfiction books I read that weren't emotional. So like just reading something that was kind of like made me feel good about it. It made me happy. It felt right, you know, like it was just what I wanted. It gave me what I wanted when I needed it. So 4 stars. Again, I'm not sure how hard I would recommend this. Like, I don't think it was a bad book, but I do think it had some flaws, and I can understand why other people wouldn't like it. But I did. It made me happy and sad. I cried. Like, anything that makes me cry is kind of like a win in my book, even if it's kind of like a cheap cry. So that was it for my 4-star rates for the month. I have 2 books left to talk about. Both negative, so that was the end of happiness. The first is Women in Sunlight by Frances Mays, which is a novel about 4 American women in Italy. One is a writer who's middle-aged, she's like 40-ish, who's been living in Italy for years with her long-term significant other. And then the other 3 women, I think, are in their 60s. I'm distracted by Mimi, who's just in my pile of books over there. Very concerned that, like, she's just gonna knock them all over. The other 3 women are in their 60s, and we're touring, like, a retirement community to, like, see if this was kind of where they were gonna live, because they're all single, they're all older women. They're like, is this the point in our lives where, like, we join a retirement community and kind of, like, live out our lives here? And they all decided, no, let's move to Italy instead, which apparently is what you do. And then they moved to Italy, and we're in Italy, and things happened, and one of the characters got pregnant, and that was where I DNF'd the book. I can't remember the last time I DNF'd a physical book that I owned. Like, it was so unpleasant, like so absurdly unpleasant. I could not handle this book at all. It was like one of the worst things I've read in a very long time. I was kind of stoked on, like, the plot, because, like, oh, like, 3, like, older women who, like, go to Italy together, like, living their lives kind of, like, starting over in a way. Like, oh, like, they're looking at a retirement community, but instead they just start over someplace else, and, like, that's really, really cool. I was super down for that. And then, I don't know, it just, like, didn't work at all. The writing style itself was so fragmented and disjointed, and sometimes that can be, like, really, like, beautiful and artsy and, like, whatever, but this was not. I had the hardest time just following, like, the basic information, like, the things that were, like, happening in the book. I was like, what is going on? Like, please help somebody. Like, I kept having to reread passages because they would talk about, like, a dog is there, and I'm like, who does the dog belong to? Like, basic information, and I just couldn't figure it out. And eventually I'd just be like, probably this woman, I guess. I couldn't really tell them apart. Mostly when they were speaking, it was hard to follow. There was so much dialogue, just, like, constant streams of dialogue. At one point, a character went through her entire life story in, like, 5 pages of straight dialogue, which was so unpleasant. None of them spoke like real people either. Like, they would just say things, and it's like, people do not talk like that. At one point, one of the characters got pregnant, and her significant other was going on about, like, oh, that's so amazing. Like, first of all, he guessed, which was weird because she was, like, in her 40s, and that would not be my first guess. Second of all, he's like, oh, I know the night it happened. It was 6 or 7 weeks ago. We've made love since, but nothing that was as special as that night. And it's like, okay, first of all, not how people talk. Second of all, not how sex works. Third of all, please stop. This was the point where I was just so bored and so irritated. I was like, I don't know that I can do this. And then I realized that I was still 40 pages from the halfway point, and I couldn't. I had to DNF it. It was so unpleasant. Like, I didn't rate this because I didn't finish it, but, like, would have been 1 star, probably. Unless it, like, magically got better. But it was disappointing because, like, the actual, like, plot and the premise sounded really interesting. I mean, I didn't know what it was about, but, like, once I got into it, it was like, the premise was interesting. It was just so poorly executed. And also, this is unrelated, all of, like, the descriptions of this book, like, the reviews, like, that they put on, like, the back and everything, and, like, whatever, are talking about her amazing descriptions of food. Like, it doesn't count as an amazing description of food when you're just listing the ingredients. Like, that was all she would do. She would just, like, list the ingredients in a dish. She would be like, oh, this, like, lamb is baked with rosemary and basil and an olive oil balsamic glaze, whatever. I don't know. I'm making stuff up. But, like, that's what it would be. It would be like, yeah, we sat down to a meal of croissants with a berry glaze over them. And it's like, you can't just list the components of the dish, and that doesn't, like, count as a beautiful description of food. That's just, like, listing the components of the dish. Oh, it was so annoying because, like, I don't know, that's not what beautifully describing things is. I hated this. Immediate unhaul, just, like, so fast. This was so unpleasant. I mean, like, kudos, I guess, to people who like it, but I could not. And then the final thing then I read this month was Candy by Kevin Brooks, which is a YA novel published in like the mid 2000s. It feels like a YA novel published in the mid 2000s. 2 stars. This is about a middle class slash upper middle, I think maybe rich, he might just be a rich boy, wealthy child who meets this girl who he discovers is a sex worker, and she's about his age, I think, and he decides to save her. That's the whole plot. She has a very evil pimp who's forcing her, and she wants to get clean because I think she's on heroin. And he's just, I'm going to save her by myself and help her detox by myself and fight her evil pimp by myself, and the end. Not my favorite plot. I really don't like plots like this, like that involve around sex workers, because it's mostly written so poorly and just like from the perspective of someone who clearly knows nothing about sex work, and they're just writing like this weird self-insert fantasy about saving a sex worker who falls in love with you, which is basically what this feels like. Things I liked about this book, his writing style. I do tend to like the way he writes things, and also the ending. It had this like really nice feeling of incompleteness while still offering enough closure that like it feels final and it feels like it's ended the book. It was really nice and lovely. I just liked the way it was done. Pretty much other than that, nothing. This book was kind of garbage and really racist. The number of people in this book who were described as big scary black men was a lot, including his sister's boyfriend, who seemed like a really nice dude. Just like normal average dude, had a job working in a hospital, and he was like, wow, my sister's boyfriend looks a lot like this girl's big scary black guy pimp. And like that was how he kept describing them. A lot of racism. The whole story is about this girl, the titular character, the girl on the cover. Her whole existence is the catalyst for this book and the events that unfold. However, she is barely treated as a character or a person or anything. She's very much an insert for like the main character to put everything, his feelings, his thoughts, whatever, his desires into. She's this weird combination of like manic pixie dream girl and also damsel in distress, and no personality and nothing. She's not a person. Like, it was really, really uncomfortable to read for that. She talks a lot in this book about being beautiful and like in a genuine sense, like she's more beautiful than like the average person, and how that felt like growing up being like normal and then being like beautiful, and how that was weird for her, and how she hated it and how it was kind of like unpleasant. But this whole book is the main character seeing this girl, thinking she is absurdly beautiful, and becoming obsessed with her based on that and that alone. And it didn't feel like a critique of that. It just felt like that's what the book was. It was like missing its own point, kind of. Yeah, this was kind of miserable to read. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't know what you would get out of it. I'm still gonna read the other 2 Kevin Brooks books that I have on my shelf, because I have 2 more, one of which I think is a reread, but I'm not 100% sure. But I'm gonna read those. I did like his writing style. It's just I didn't like what he chose to write about, or how he chose to write it. But we'll see. Hopefully those are better than this, because this was kind of, at best, nothing, and at worst, very, very racist and offensive and sexist, and just not a good story. Don't read it. Read basically anything else that I talked about in the first part of this video. Don't read Women in Sunlight or Candy. So that was everything that I read in July. 8 books? 9 books? 8 books? I don't know. A decent number of books. I'm happy with it. Let me know down below if you've read any of these, what you thought of them if you have, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.